All right, and welcome back. So that was a great start for this conference. Now we're going to jump into our first panel, electrification versus nuclear versus hydrogen. Have renewables, electrification, and decentralization already won? Or do we need a variety of solutions? And how do all of these fit together in our clean energy future? And before we begin, I do just want to remind everyone to please interact in our Q&A, and we will ask our panelists your questions. So joining us today, we have three energy experts. We first have Morten Stahl. Morten is an experienced entrepreneur and investor specializing in natural hydrogen ventures and sustainable energy initiatives. He is a managing partner at Natural Hydrogen Ventures, NHV, actively investing in the global hydrogen supply chain, and the creator of the NHV's NAT H2 Index, a tool for tracking publicly listed natural hydrogen companies. Joining him is Constanze Adolf. Constanze is a strategy consultant for the energy industry at the company Items. She has successfully led international projects and developed business cases for innovative energy concepts such as energy storage solutions. And then finally, we have Jessica Johnson. Jessica is the Communications and Advocacy Director at Nucleareurope in Brussels. She has been representing the nuclear industry across Europe since 2017. She is also responsible for Nucleareurope's sustainability policies, including work on the sustainable finance taxonomy. So, welcome to the three of you. Thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Yeah.
And so actually, Constanze, I will start with you. So we realize that each of these technologies serves a different role in terms of energy production, storage, consumption, and will likely complement each other in various ways in different markets. But we want to discuss what these roles might look like and look at some of the major challenges and controversies surrounding them. So to start, is it, in your opinion, a question of one or the other, or do they all need to work together in the future? Constanze might be muted. Let's skip to Morten just for right now until we figure out Constanze's sound. So, Morten, actually, this kind of goes hand in hand with what I just asked. What role do each of these technologies, the clean electricity, nuclear, and hydrogen, what do they play in achieving a sustainable energy mix?
Well, basically, they're all part of the mix, and where one thing stands out here, that is hydrogen. It isn't really an energy. It's for most circumstances, it's an energy carrier. So the base load would be run by electricity. We need electricity so much. But quickly running through the three different, I would say clean electricity, solar, wind is very often the cheapest option if you're building new in generation. So that should be default to do this. Nuclear will be needed for baseload power if you need clean baseload energy when solar and wind doesn't produce. But also in some areas you would need nuclear, maybe because the sun doesn't shine very often or the wind doesn't blow. And then finally you will have hydrogen, which you need to produce liquid fuels, fertilizer, chemicals. Actually, a lot of the really boring stuff that we never discuss and see. So likely, very likely, you will never touch hydrogen or use it directly. Maybe in a car, but probably never in the grid for gas because it's needed for the boring stuff.
Okay. And So actually, so if you're saying that we don't really need we need the hydrogen just for the boring stuff, what other gaps then would nuclear fill?
The base load. When because we know all the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine. You need something strong base load power. And as we saw in the keynote speak just before, you can do stuff with grid balancing and storage, but very likely we will be surprised by how much new electricity we will eventually use as a world. So we need to get rid of fossil fuels, but we need to grow. So basically, and I think that's important to remember when discussing energy, we need everything. We are so much behind. We need to press all the buttons at once. We need nuclear. We need hydrogen. We need renewable of any kind. There's no silver bullet here. And we're running behind. We just need to get going.
And then Jessica, actually jumping to you, going off of that, do you think it's possible for partnerships to form between these three sectors or even two of them?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to really highlight what Morten said is really important. At the end of the day, we seem to be having a conversation as to which energy source we should be having in the future. The reality is our demand for energy, our demand for electricity is going to be so huge in the future. It's not a question of which technology. It's a question of, even if we have all these technologies, will we still have enough to meet our needs? We strongly believe in an energy system that is really composed of all the different net zero technologies. So you would have, of course, nuclear in there. You would have the roles that renewables would play. You have heat as well, decarbonized heat, and of course, decarbonized hydrogen. We see a more of a, I think we call it kind of a hybrid energy system of the future, where you would have nuclear power alongside your wind farms and your solar farms, potentially what is known as the small modular reactors, all operating together in order to provide, first of all, the vast quantities of electricity that are going to be needed, particularly in this push for massive electrification. But also, as mentioned, these other sources, heat. Nuclear power, current large reactors produce heat, but so in future will small modular reactors. And that heat can be used for potentially sectors that may not necessarily be able to electrify. And in addition to that, the hydrogen. So you would have the electricity coming from your renewables and from your nuclear. It would go into the electrolyzer in order to produce that decarbonized hydrogen for those sectors that, once again, simply cannot electrify because their needs are just too great, and the amount of energy or the temperature is just too high for it to be met by pure electrification. So we sort of see all of these different components working together in that future energy system. And that's why we really believe it's important to move away from this conversation of it's either nuclear or it's renewables or it's hydrogen or it's this, and really focus on, okay, let's make sure that we're building as much of all these energy sources as possible in Europe to make sure that we really have enough energy to meet our needs in 2050.
Okay, and I think we might have Constanze back now.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yes,
Oh,
perfect.
wonderful. Oh, thank you. Great technology. It's all about electricity, right?
Yeah.
So here I am back.
So actually, then I'll ask the next question to you. What scalability challenges do you see associated with each of these three sectors or technologies?
First of all, let me just allow to come back to the first question, because I think this was very important. And Morten, as much as I could hear you, I just want to add that I just can't agree more what you said. I think let's have a look maybe at some numbers that are quite promising, and I think that's maybe also shows how important these discussions are that we have at the moment. So in 2023, if I remember correctly, we have 50% in CO2 cuts in electricity compared to 2008. I think this is a big advantage that we have at the moment. And we had last year 68% of low carbon electricity in the market. To the question, I also think that there is not one size fits all principle here, because we are in very different energy systems in the EU. And that's an important thing and lever also. I mean, I'm from Germany, so yes, we have more than 75% sometimes in the grid, but we still have coal. So there is not, as I said, not one size fits all in here. And I think that's where this kind of, I mean, the electricity is not a Swiss Army knife. You would then need it when it's cheaper, safer, and more convenient, and if there is no alternative. And then we have to see, where do you use it for? Do you use it more for industry, and where can it really then replace and decarbonize? Do you need it for households, and what can you decarbonize there? And I think we have to balance out these kind of trilemmas that we have. I mean, every healthy energy systems needs to be secure, equitable, and also environmental sustainable. And balancing those trilemmas, I think that's an important one. Now, coming back to your question, I think it's all about a kind of careful orchestration of all these different aspects that you just said. And for me, especially because I'm working so much in the kind of storage environment, I like, and I want to like to quote Gerard Reed, who said, energy transition is not finding a new source of energy, but it's finding a new source of storage. And I think with hydrogen, we have one lever for this, for a long kind of time storage and a good energy carrier. But coming back to numbers, I mean, we have a huge challenge in front of us, because if you look at batteries, for instance, we have 50 megawatts of battery capacity at the moment running in the EU. And the more we increase renewables and the fluctuating energy that we have, the more kind of batteries and other storage system we will need. And we will need to build up more than threefold of these 50 megawatts in the next 5 years. And I think that's the challenge that we have ahead. And that's why we need all of them. And I think that's where different sources and also different cultures in different countries and systems coming into play.
Okay, that's interesting. Going back a little bit to when you answered the first question, you said that it's not a one size fits all, which I find very interesting. Do you mean that even within Europe, it's not like one way of balancing all three technologies is going to work for every single country? Like they're all going to have to like strike their own balance?
Yes, I would certainly underline what you say. Maybe a very personal view on this. I lived in Brussels for a long time, and I did a long time some energy policies at Brussels level, and that was very interesting and insightful for me to learn the different energy systems in different countries. So something that strikes me a lot, and I think that's one key of the electricity system in Europe, is that we don't have really interconnectors. We have a good energy system that works. We have got a very reliable electricity system, and my own country, Germany, is benefiting from that a lot. I give you one example. Until last year, we've been an energy exporter, and since last year, we are an energy importer, and that's mainly also thanks to France. So we import some nuclear energy from France, something that is quite contested, to be honest, in Germany. But I think the trade balance is quite balanced. But without these energies, we might produce much more electricity from coal. So what do I want to say? When I came to Brussels, something that struck me was you had all these maps of more and more dense cooperation between EU countries, more trade within European countries, more exchange. But when it came to the electricity system, I mean, even in the defense system, a very sensitive political issue. But in the moment when you came to the electricity system, you saw stopping electricity lines 20 kilometers before national borders. And I think that's something where we have a huge potential in much more interconnectivity between the countries. And this is not only due to electricity, but also for hydrogen. I mean, looking at these big interconnectors that we want to build between Spain and France, as well as Spain and Portugal, something that might be very interesting and very important. But I think that's something where I see a lot of big advantages, not only because of exchange and cooperation, but also because of security of supply and reliability. So maybe last sentence. on the renewables in Germany, each year our regulator publishes a report on the kind of electricity supply and the reliability of the system. And the more renewables we have, the more decentralized we get, the more reliable the system is, and the less kind of outrages we have. And that's a good sign, which encourages, I think, a lot to look much more into those systems.
Okay. And so actually going back a little bit to Morten, I believe you said that hydrogen would still be needed to power vehicles. Um, if that is true, if that is what I heard, I apologize if it wasn't. What advancements do you think would be necessary to make that competitive?
Well, I think you probably heard me saying the exact opposite, but
Ah,
I can put some flavor to it. Um, it's important to understand that when most people think of hydrogen, they think of actually it's a product produced by either electricity, we call it green hydrogen using a color scheme, or the old way using natural gas, which is very polluting but produces kind of cheap hydrogen that we use for all the industrial purposes, mainly fertilizer. And now we're talking about hydrogen. We want to use excess electricity to then produce hydrogen, and it's great. It's technically possible. But anyone following the industry will know that there's been a lot of cancellation of these projects because it very often ends up being too expensive. And a price of something does, of course, mean a lot.
mhm,
So you will only use a commodity if it's reasonably priced. And I think for hydrogen, it's the case that if we only produce it, there will be very few areas where, as a society, we're willing to pay that extra price. But luckily, what we do is investing only in a new type of hydrogen that is called natural hydrogen, or sometimes even geologic hydrogen, or what, or white, or gold. You see that the jury is
mhm,
still out on this. That is hydrogen that you are not producing, and it completely changes the way of thinking of hydrogen, because it's hydrogen that you can extract from the subsurface, just like oil and gas. It's still very early stage. We know it exists. We're going to figure out how much you can actually extract. But let's imagine it's doable. And then because you're not buying electricity to produce it, this could be really cheap. And that turns things on its head, because then you won't be discussing, is this a waste of electricity? Which it might be, turning electricity into hydrogen to put it in a car. You could just use it as electricity. So cheap hydrogen in the form of, my best guess would be natural hydrogen, would mean that in some places, yes, it would make sense to put it into cars or trucks. You could imagine, especially in areas where we are not good at building out the grid or have a strong enough grid. There
mhm,
are many developing countries where that might be needed. Maybe even in some developed countries, because we don't really seem to get our shit together and actually build out the grid in the way that's needed. It can't carry all the electrification we're going to need. It's not so sexy to build new pylons and stuff, but it's really, really needed. So that's a problem where hydrogen as a liquid fuel, a derived product, might be able to help, but only if it's cheap enough.
May I perhaps add on this? I think something that is also often underestimated is hydrogen as a product input. I think in chemistry industry as well as in steel. I think we often think of hydrogen of just an energy carrier or an energy source, but it's much more. And I think here as well, for the decarbonization of industry, that's really an important lever. And I just want to underline what you said. It's about prices, and the I think the worst thing that I can think of is something that I observe. I don't know any politician that wants to lower gas prices, and I think that's the big challenge for us as well as ahead, having high subsidies on natural gas and looking how to then electrify. That will be a big challenge.
Okay, and so what role do this? I would go to all three of you then. Do all of you see the grid infrastructure playing in supporting the energy mix of all three, like of such diverse sources? Because obviously it sounds like the grid is going to play a role, but do you have like maybe specific examples?
Maybe just to say, for nuclear, we have the grids in place. I think this is where you have this cost conversation that comes into it, because you very often hear nuclear is more expensive than renewables. Part of the challenge that renewables have is maybe the solar panel or the wind farm is not that expensive, but you do have very hefty other costs that need to be taken into consideration. And that includes, for example, the additional grids that are needed, the backup technologies, for when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. So grids are a very important role. We do face a massive issue in Europe today, that there is a significant bottleneck around the grid. So for the time being, for nuclear, it's not a problem. I think for heavy industry, I think this is where it could be quite interesting. And I mentioned before small modular reactors. The idea would be to kind of create this hybrid energy system next to industrial clusters, for example, and that would reduce the need for the grid. It would also reduce one of the biggest cost factors for the hydrogen, and that's the transport. One of the biggest cost issues for hydrogen is the storage and the transportation. So if, as I mentioned before, you have your small modular reactor, you have your wind and you have your solar all feeding into that electrolyzer to produce hydrogen and supply it to heavy industry, that could be a really great model, because you don't have all those additional grid problems to take into account. You don't have the costs that go associated with the storage and the transport of the hydrogen. And you're also able to provide the additional benefits that I mentioned before. So the electricity and the heat for those industries that would use those other energy sources.
Okay. And then talking about the different European countries, Constanze, this goes back to you. How do the economics of scaling these technologies vary by European country and energy market?
Well, that's a highly political question, I think. I mean, going back from where the nuclear is coming from, obviously from France. I take France as a good example. I think here it very clearly shows how much energy industry or energy policy is interlinked with also natural or national big structures and strategies. I think the nuclear industry in France was built after the Second World War to really kind of build a reliable and mainly an independent energy system against the US, whilst my own country very much relied on coal and then on very expensive gas imports from Russia. So I think there you always already see that this is not a technical question, it's much more also a political question. In Spain, for example, very important example, they built out a lot of solar in the early 2000s, and they had a kind of feed-in tariff that they retrospectively then cancelled. And that was a catastrophe for the system. So today, interestingly, while I would say Spain is one of the most kind of sunny countries, they don't have so much solar. They have much more wind than solar. And obviously, it's also a windy country. But there you see already how much those kind of historical political structures interfere into our energy systems. Looking into your country, Morten, I mean, I think you might have heard that Germany had a huge outrage last year because we wanted to phase out heat boilers. And I think Denmark did that in 2015 quite quietly and with a huge success to decarbonize heating system. And if we look at those things, I think something that we should not forget is that here we mostly talk about electricity, but I also want to come to heat and to decarbonize our heating systems, because I think that's something that all the different countries have in common. We have around 50 or 25% of the entire energy that is needed is electricity. Then we've got 25% roughly on mobility, but 50% in different temperature needs and heat and steam needs in industry, but also in households. And here also, I think renewables and electrification can play a major role. And this is, again, we see this in France and in Belgium as well, where I lived for quite a while, that you've got a lot of electric heating systems, which are now becoming more and more expensive sometimes, and sometimes not, because you have a heat pump and then you have this kind of independence issue as well. So what I see is that regardless where we are coming from, Eastern European countries more reliable on coal and maybe nuclear, Germany who wants to really phase out not only nuclear, that's what we did last year, but also coal until 2038. It's about shifting our heads towards a new energy system. I think the problem is that we are still bound a lot in this old energy system, but we have to think of and have to make up our minds into what is a new energy system needed. And I think this was said before. Yes, we have volatile renewables, and that means you need another kind of help to have a very stable grid. And that is, for me, it's storage. And I think you need different storage systems, and to kind of have the orchestration of these different means in order to have a reliable system. I want to give you one example. And that's something where I think we are at crossroads at the moment in different systems in different countries. Until 30% of renewables in the system, you are quite likely to be very successful with batteries and some very kind of low level storage systems that help to stabilize the grid. But if you go beyond 30% of renewables, you definitely need to change the system, because you have a lot of loads of energy, and you need to then couple different energy systems in order to kind of transform these electricity, be it in mobility or be it then in, for instance, heating system. And I myself worked for a long time in high temperature heat storage to decarbonize big industries, and that was quite a huge success. That needs to come and needs to be built up much more, in my opinion. And then after 60%, you need much more long-term duration storage, where hydrogen also comes in many places. And I could speak for hours about this, but I think this is something that I want to make up here. It's about storing, it's about sharing energy, it's about shifting loads, and then it's about looking into different supply forms.
Morten and Jessica, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think we touch on different kind of politics in different countries. I think one thing that we should be aware of also as private persons is that one of the huge problems with the energy transition is what you would see described as NIMBYism. That means not in my backyard. And it's otherwise, very environmental friendly citizens thinking, yeah, but we want solar, but not where I live. Or, yeah, I want nuclear, but far away. Or, some people tell me, why should we go and drill and explore the subsurface for hydrogen or anything really? Why can't we just build windmills? And I'm telling these Danes that somewhere in the world, there's a big hole in the ground where you dug up all the stuff for the windmills. So it needs to be done. If we want batteries, we need lithium. So we have to accept that somewhere there'll be a lithium mine. It can't be, in China or Africa. It end up being a supply chain problem and a security risk. So if you want to point your finger to someone, there's some really good fossil fuel companies who maybe done some not so impressive work for the environment. But we need everyone to be able and ready to accept that from your summer house, you will see a wind turbine. Because if you don't, you are not sacrificing something for the energy transition to make sure that we leave a planet worth living on to our children. Stop NIMBYism.
I would agree with that. I think there needs to be this basic conversation with people to say, look, at the end of the day, you want to have access to energy when you need it. You want to be able to flip a switch and your lights turn on. You want to be able to heat your homes in winter. You want to be able to charge your mobile phone, turn your TV on. That means some kind of compromises. And we're seeing, for example, some actors who at one point were saying we don't need nuclear, we can have 100% renewables. It's totally doable. And now all of a sudden we're talking, well, we need to open mines. Maybe we should look at opening mines in Europe. And those same actors are now fighting against the opening of mines. You need to open the mines in order to have the raw materials to produce those renewables. And so there seems to be a kind of a lack of understanding that these things do come from somewhere. They don't just magically appear. And I think there is a role for policymakers there to just kind of explain to people, look, you want to have all these benefits, you want to have the jobs that go, for example, in the nuclear industry, it's a massive employer in Europe. You want to have these jobs in Europe. You want to have access to the energy when you need it. You want to keep industries in Europe, so for the jobs again, or for the economic growth, or whatever. That comes with trade-offs. You have to accept that means that there is going to be some form of energy production close to where you are. You are going to have some kind of industries in Europe. And yes, if we are needing the raw materials, and those raw materials are available in Europe, then maybe we should be extracting them in Europe, where we can really keep control and make sure it's being done in the right way. So I think the problem is with it, coming back to this point that I said earlier, we're so busy in this argument of it's either or and fighting and pitching one technology against the other that we've just forgotten that bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that that today people need to have access to energy. People, businesses, industries, they've got to have access to energy when they need it. And that energy does need to be affordable. So they need to be able to pay that bill. So they need to have them, it needs to be at a reasonable cost. But at the same time, we have a climate crisis. We mentioned Spain. We've seen the situation in Spain last week. We do need to tackle the current climate crisis, and that means that we do need to be investing in these decarbonized technology, be it renewables or be it nuclear or low carbon hydrogen, etc. So I think policymakers need to move away from this either or approach and really sit around the table and say, okay, these are the problems that we've got. In order to tackle these problems, we really need to focus on these goals and let all those technologies that can help us meet them, and preferably in Europe, I should add. I don't think we should be looking to import our energy sources anymore. I think we should be looking to produce as much of it as possible in Europe to have control over it. And I think that's where policymakers really need to do a lot of the legwork now.
So actually going off of that, and this is a question for all three of you, how do you think policymakers can support the coexistence of all of these technologies?
Well, first of all, I think at EU level, we have to kind of take into consideration that EU policy will not interfere into the choice of different energy mixes. That's a really national competence. And so every country is responsible or kind of able to look into the most efficient, as they would say, efficient policy mix that they have. So something that is important here, in my opinion, is that the EU energy market is there to regulate an efficient internal EU energy market. And I think here there are definitely things that we can strengthen. It's, for me, actually, it's not about kind of subsidizing the one or the other one. It's looking into those subsidies which exist and the kind of total cost for society. As you said before, we need raw materials, that's for sure. We have also nuclear waste that we have to deal with. That's another question. We have safety and security issues and transportation, for instance, of hydrogen. So I think the challenge that I see is that we have a new energy system in front of us. Nobody already tested it. We have this hen and egg problem. And we have to have a highly kind of effective and efficient policy making process, which contradicts in a way into the policy cycle, because this policy cycle goes 4 to 5 years, depending where you are. But here we are really talking about long-term infrastructures that we have to rebuild. And I think that's a big question. And something, last sentence from my side, that we didn't talk about is obviously energy efficiency. It's like every kilowatt hour that we don't spend is the cheapest one that we can have, as well as energy pricing. So looking into the EU ETS, for instance, and what kind of benefits that could bring also into decarbonization.
And Morten, Jessica,
Yep.
would you have something to add?
Yeah, I would maybe add, it's a point I made earlier. Policymakers need to focus on goals. They need to stop cherry picking technologies. I mean, we have a situation today where France has one of the most decarbonised energy grids in Europe alongside Sweden, and yet it's potentially going to be hit with a fine from the European Commission simply because it's not met its renewables target. What is the goal today? Is the goal to decarbonise our electricity system, or is the goal to have more renewables on the grid? And that's where I think policymakers have perhaps not really focused on the right goals. The goals need to be having access to enough energy to meet our needs, preferably producing it in Europe, making sure that energy is decarbonised and making sure that energy is affordable. And then let the market decide which technologies they think will fit the bill. Don't already start by saying, we want you to choose this or we want you to choose that, because then that also creates instability, I think, because it's down to personal preferences at that point. And when you have changes in government, then that can lead to changes in technologies that we support or don't support. And that level of instability also affects investors. Investors want to have this long-term vision, and the best way of having that long-term vision to encourage them to invest in the right technologies is to say, you can invest in any technology which helps achieve our goals.
And I'll echo that in the pure hydrogen space, saying that natural hydrogen as a real resource, as an industry, we aren't asking for subsidies. If this works, it doesn't need it, and it'll be game changing because it'll be that cheap and clean. But if you are handing out subsidies for hydrogen, we want it to be a level playing field. And we want it to be termed on carbon intensity, not if it's produced by it one way or the other. And we tend in Europe to do that. We tend to, as you just said, cherry pick, say we want everything to be electrified, which I actually think technology-wise it is a good idea, but you gotta let the market work it out. So just require it to be zero or low carbon, put a number on it, and then see what works best. I think that I'll wish for that, and generally wish for us to be allowed as an industry to explore for it. That's the first step, and then it doesn't have a cost, but it takes time. Politics, of course.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a little towards the end of the panel, so actually, to ask you guys all one more question as a group. In your opinion, is there a European country right now that is succeeding in balancing all three technologies? Like, is there one that stands out among the rest?
Good question.
Well, I haven't looked much into the general thing, but I think it's impressive that France, they have been the first to change the resource laws so that you can in France explore for natural hydrogen. Basically, just allowing private industry to spend or waste, whatever how you see it, their own money trying to solve this problem. And I think that's important. And adding to that, they have nuclear. They're doing something renewable. So my best guess would be France covering all of it. But that's very much with natural hydrogen glasses on.
For me, Denmark is a very good example. Excuse me. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Denmark is a good example for a very simple technology. It's district heating, because Denmark has got this high or kind of water-based district heating system. If I understood that correctly, that's a very cheap and easy to install system that is very reliable. Brilliant kind of storage from the summer into the winter season. That's a very good one. Personally, I'm very curious about my own country, Germany, because this is an experiment. I mean, we want to kind of go as a highly industrialized country. We want to switch into renewables as much as we can. We are in the midst of this transformation, and that's why it's difficult to say we go in one or the other direction. What I can say is that at the moment, the last couple of years, we had an enormous amount of renewables kind of coming into the grid, and now we have this kind of back and forth movements where sometimes you think you have to balance more or less. You have different, obviously, political opinions, and here in the end, the market will do it. But what we can see is that the prices really came down because of the low price of electricity kind of production costs, and that was a very good one. But I already mentioned there are different kind of aspects to it, be it import and exports, and where the electricity is coming from, or where we also kind of press our excess electricity to other countries. And by the way, excess electricity, we should stop talking about this, because electricity is a very valuable one, and it's about balancing it out. And I think that's the big challenge, to really orchestrate this in this trilemma that I just mentioned when I starting the conversation.
From my side, I would say it really depends what your goal is. I think if your goal is to decarbonize your energy system and really reduce your dependence on imports, I would agree that France is probably best in class alongside Sweden. I think Sweden is another example of a country that, thanks to hydro and nuclear, it has managed to very efficiently decarbonize its energy system. What both of them are also doing is they're really looking into using their decarbonized electricity grid to produce decarbonized hydrogen that can then be used to support heavy industry. We see, for example, in Sweden, that they're looking to use it to produce so-called green steel. France as well, they're really looking to ramp up electrolyzer capacity in the hope that that can support their industries. And France also, they have managed, thanks probably mostly to nuclear, they've already managed to decarbonize a lot of their industry by switching them to electrification. If you look at the aluminium industry in France, it's electrified, and that has, of course, brought down its CO2 emissions because of the CO2 content of the electricity that's receiving. So I think it really does depend on what your ultimate goal is, but I think if the goal is to decarbonize and to reduce dependence on third countries, I think probably Sweden and France are two good examples of that.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a great note to end on, actually. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. And yeah, it's been a great discussion.